So today we thought we'd talk a little bit about the impact of human error in the industry, and we found an article from ARC back from 2019, but we believe it's still valid, published in Intake magazine that talked about some of the issues around human error and the impact on industry. And that report put a very large number out there, $1 trillion cost in unplanned downtime in the worldwide process industry. So a very big number. And they put out some interesting factors as part of that. And we sort of talk through some of those today on this podcast. Just listing those out, we had operator graphics was one of them, control room designs, a simulation, procedural automation, which I guess is a newish one, alarm management and situation awareness technologies. So I guess from your perspective, Marsha, I mean, do you see any of those still being big issues in industry that you come across?
Yeah, I do. So when it comes to my background is in simulation, and the so of course the training kind of stands out, right? Training can be a big investment for companies, and it's one of those that is, uh, you know, not a direct impact on cost, right? You
Mhm.
kind of have to evaluate, you have to do a risk assessment and think about like what is the overall impact of an operator making a mistake, and you have to kind of do this complex business analysis and say, is training the right answer? And so it can be kind of hard to justify. Ultimately it comes down to this, a safety perspective. And from my experience, training is very often worth the investment, but
Mhm.
getting that adoption and maintaining a simulation is a challenge that persists, certainly. Another one that kind of stands out from that list is uh, improved alarm management
Mhm.
because, some of the there are some really great alarm management software packages out there, but when they're dynamic, sometimes they're difficult to be able to like configure until the whole system is built, and really it's a after startup. So whether it's a modernization or a capital project, or a greenfield capital project. You're going through startup and spending all of this time, and you are getting flooded because you don't really know. You haven't been through every possible path in process. And because of that, like you do run into these alarm floods. And if you don't have and then suddenly your operational
Mhm.
team has a bunch of alarm management that they need to suddenly do. So I certainly still see those in particular as kind of key points that I've
Mhm.
run into. I know you spent quite a bit of time in like the operator graphics and control room design space. I guess what's your experience?
I think we're making big strides in industry in both areas, but as you say, it's taken the opportunity of when a project that can bear the cost comes up. Something like graphics, people wait for upgrades on their systems. Maybe a greenfield they can start with best practice, but typically there's a barrier of cost which companies find difficult to get over. Same with control room design. I mean, we went through a big push to get control rooms out of dangerous areas. We took them outside the process areas, and we justify that on safety. But maybe not did the best job in looking at some of the other factors of the control room. And now we're going back and saying, okay, we want a centralized control room, or we want a CIO or some other type of control philosophy. Well, now the cost is maybe prohibitive, and
Mhm.
people end up sort of shoehorning them in existing locations. So I think, like you say, it's there's some barriers that we're trying to get across. And to your point of using simulation not just for training, you, there's alarm management or graphics and things like that as a test bed. And I don't know if you're seeing
Right.
more of that for engineering uses for simulation.
Yeah, and to be able to, well, and that kind of leads into state-based automation too, right? In
Hmm.
order to deploy state-based automation, you really need a simulation behind the scenes to be able to say like, okay, this is actually going to work, right? Because you need
Hmm.
the feedback to be able to change states. Um, but procedural automation, I think some companies are having a lot of great success with that. I think it kind of depends on like who is your who is your operations team and who is,
Mm-hmm.
working with you? Because we've talked for a long time about how one of the reasons that you need training is that we've got a whole new slew of operators that are coming in because we're losing this older workforce. But those new operators are also getting trained on the new and the new philosophy, right? We're using state-based automation. We're using some of these new technologies, or more automated technologies to run these facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And as great as some of the operators who can walk into the facility and kind of hear a rattle off in the distance and figure out what's going on, as great as those operators are, sometimes they've been running this facility for years and years and
Mm-hmm.
years, if not decades. And so it can be hard to make a switch from, I know the best way to do it. I'm running it in manual, or I'm running it, maybe in a pseudo manual kind of state, to I push the button and it goes. And so I think that there certainly are still areas of improvement to be made in that space as well. I'm curious, you mentioned safety as one of the key, I would say, justifications for some of these kinds of projects.
Mm-hmm.
They all kind of come back to this idea of human error, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know I've been a part of some big studies where all of, it was a customer who wanted to think forward and kind of consider all of this. How can we build a plant of the future,
Mm-hmm.
right? And building out the justification actually became kind of tricky because, if all of these things are in an effort to reduce human error because of an operator mistake or because the operator is overwhelmed with information or whatever, separating the business case into these different categories so that you aren't accidentally double dipping was a bit of a challenge. So I guess, how do you approach, because if somebody is identifying, okay, this is my root cause, right? How have you approached in the past, saying like, okay, let's take a look at the business case and
Mm-hmm.
move this forward, because I think that's a big challenge for end users trying to make improvements of their facilities.
Yeah. And you're right. One of the biggest questions I get asked is, what is the return on investment? How can I
Yeah,
justify this? Right. And people quote big numbers. ASM quoted 8 to 12% if you did everything. That's a huge number. Um,
yeah,
I don't feel very comfortable using that. If somebody said, if we do all of this, you're going to get 8
yeah,
to 12% return on your investment on production
hmm,
improvements or throughput. And often I come back to say, well, you have the data. Right? You've
yes,
got the data there in your historians, in your investigations and things like that. So with a bit of data mining, you might be able to go back and look at those lost opportunities. But I think one of the problems that people find is that they stop at human error. They'll do the root cause analysis and say, okay, it was human error, and stop there. And so, well, there's many factors as part of that human error. It could have been fatigue, it could have been systems, there's a whole raft of different things. And so, having companies to push beyond that and say, okay, yeah, okay, we understand it's human error, but what were the contributing factors? You look at
yeah,
something like BP Texas City, where they did a thorough investigation, because obviously there was some significant bad outcomes from that. And they went down to saying, well, some of the graphics weren't designed correctly and the alarm management was poor and these are the alarm rates. So they went further. And so
hmm,
they would be able to say, okay, well, that cost us in real dollar terms this amount of money. So there's a cost
right,
avoidance there.
yeah. And to get down, to that point, right? Like, not stopping at human error and saying like, oh, someone made a mistake, but like, what
Hmm.
is, like, why, right? Because, I think human error is pretty complex. There's true, I think, human error, somebody's going through loss, or something is
Hmm.
happening such that the person touching, whether it's the code or the graphics or whatever, is, you know, distracted,
Hmm.
or they're overwhelmed by their environment. And then there is, I didn't understand what was happening, or the information wasn't presented properly. And so to have um, what do I want to say? Perhaps to do the full due diligence and
Hmm.
say it's time, and staffs are getting pretty lean, right? There's more contractors going on site. There's not a lot of time for these different departments, right? But to take that opportunity when something does happen, or if there's a near miss, ideally, right? To
Yeah.
say, let's talk about why. right? Like,
Hmm.
and kind of take the onus off of or the fact that there was almost a mistake or there was a mistake, not a
Hmm.
problem because it's usually not, usually there's a reason beyond just the person making a mistake, um,
Yeah.
and
I
making it
think of
okay to
it,
talk about.
it's a little bit like going to the doctors and then telling you you're sick,
Yeah,
right? I mean, you can't treat being sick. You need to know more details. And so
yeah,
that diving in to say, yeah, well, it was an alarm management issue. Well, now you've got something you can address. Um,
exactly. Yeah. And to that point, you mentioned earlier that some of the numbers that get thrown around for some of these, it's the same for simulation too, right? Sometimes if we're talking about justifications, right, you can come up with some pretty big numbers
mhm.
to cost. So it's figuring out like what is a reasonable risk reduction, because a lot of these things, right, like if they work properly, you shouldn't really see them for the most
Right,
part, right?
right.
Like, so if everything is going smoothly, you don't see it, and so you don't really feel the impact of it
Hmm.
unless you've been going down a lot, I guess, right? Then you would notice. But the to be able to have a sometimes you need the flashy number because you need to be able to get the attention of the right financial stakeholders, but also just to be able to sit down and say like, okay, there I've seen customers where, if especially if you're a continuous process, right? Shutdown is a huge deal. So like we're just going to try to prevent one shutdown and we have multiple shutdowns a year. We know that um at least, we have history that says that it is because of X, right? Like maybe it's that the operator um didn't have the right information presented. So this is an
Hmm.
alarm management issue. And so to be able to say, okay, what is the cost of going down and coming back up, right? I think that's why this number is so shocking, is because you have to think about that's production that you're not making. If you're sold
Hmm.
out or if you could be selling that product, like that's usually the biggest contributor to some of
Hmm.
these estimates. But like, kind of identifying like what is a reasonable reduction to make,
Right, right.
rather than these kind of like broad stroke, articles will talk about like, oh, if so many of your shutdowns are because of operator error or whatever. It's like, okay, well, what if we just decrease it by one? And
Yeah,
it can be amazing that you're saving, hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million, just from reducing it by the one. And you might get more benefit than that, but that way at least
hmm.
you're not over promising, perhaps,
Right, right, right.
the value. Or if you want multiple of these projects, right, you could assign, and say, like, okay, well, we've identified that last year, we've had a shutdown because of X and Y. So we're
Hmm.
going to run both of those projects and assign a reasonable return on investment to each, as
Yeah.
opposed to accidentally double dipping.
And I think too, there's, we have API 754, which talks about, sort of safety KPIs, if you like. And
Mm-hmm.
I still don't see a very big usage of that. Looking at loss of containment events, looking at incidents, and looking at that sort of pyramid of accidents and so on, and tracking those numbers. I mean, we track lost time and all that things, but the actual process incidents, I'm not sure we do a great job in industry of doing that. And again, that might be a way that not just evaluating, but then auditing your performance. Sort of saying, okay, well, we spent this money, but yeah, loss of containment incidences remained the same. So maybe we need to be doing
Yeah.
something different. That continuous improvement aspect of it, and institutionalizing the knowledge that you gain from that too. And maybe that's in the simulation systems, or it's in the configuration, or wherever it is. But capturing that and then rolling that back in to gain those benefits, not just doing the investigation and saying we've got a problem. Or we need to fix alarm management, but well, now you've got to follow up on it. And I think again, looking at resources in terms of money and internal people is difficult sometimes to get that buy-in and that activity completed.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, like I do think safety is often, like, I wouldn't say that safety is overlooked, right? Like a lot of companies have
Hmm.
it as one of their core values. But when we're looking at these justifications and things, right? Like,
Hmm.
to that point, like considering not just because there was an incident, but that as a motivation, right? And it should be a very strong motivation, to
hmm
get some of these different things implemented because safety incidents, in addition to being, very tragic and having implications like, um, when you're making business justifications, they also come with a lot of mitigation costs and things like
hmm
that. So to be able to kind of leverage that perspective, right? Because we're always, when we're talking about these things, like considering your audience, right? And what's important today and what's important
hmm
today to a lot of the stakeholders that you have to convince.
Yeah,
I feel
yeah,
like the engineering community is like, oh yeah, I would love to have a flashy new control room where my operators are sitting and have the information presented properly and all of this kind
hmm
of stuff, right? But
And I think too,
ultimately, you have to justify it to someone.
yeah, and I think too, we're sort of seeing the whole EHS part, right? I mean, it's not just safety anymore. We
Right.
started with safety 30 years ago. That was a cost money to companies. If you had an
Yeah.
accident, there would be money. Then, health came in, so we started thinking about ergonomics because, again, if you have an issue with, your hearing or your ergonomics or those sorts of things, it costs the company. And then suddenly environmental became a lot more important, and now environmental excursions can cost maybe more than a safety incident. And so,
Hmm.
all these things are returns that you can get at, and a lot of them have the same sort of fixes, if you like. But
Hmm.
I don't think we can, ignore those other pieces where if you do that data
Right.
mining, think about, do you have people off long-term sickness because of issues? What is that costing the company? Do we have excursions in our wastewater treatment system? Again, may not be a recordable or something like that, but again, it's another cost that maybe we can claw back by doing better on some of these things.
Yeah. And those are the kinds of things, working in kind of consulting,
Mhm.
it's, there's a certain amount of guidance that happens, and then it comes down to asking the right questions, right?
Yeah.
To figure out what these different areas to evaluate for returns or for not only for returns but also just problem solving and saying like if you
Mhm.
maybe we have a reason that we want new graphics right in a particular area, but it's going to be a lot easier to get a justification for like a larger capital project, right? So to ask the question and say like, well, have we looked at, because I think people overlook utilities sometimes,
Mhm.
um, but it is a really important part of the plant. And to say like, that actually, to your point, if we're talking about environmental and some of these other things, like, is that a potential additional area to say, you know what, we need to start our overhaul of our graphics because we've got, not only do we have maybe moderate or kind of menial savings in the process,
Mhm.
but actually we could save quite a bit if we were giving the operators the right information in utilities because we're exceeding our environmental releases or whatever that might be at your facility. So,
Yeah. And you and I were talking earlier about procedural automation too being perhaps a newer one on the list. And you had
mhm,
some thoughts around, how that was being um, maybe not implemented well, but not maintained well. And then, if you turn it
mhm.
off and things like that, you had some good points around that maybe you could share.
Yeah. Well, and with procedural automation, it's, well, and I think it depends on how far you take it, right?
Mhm.
Because for a
Right.
continuous process, like if it's just starting up the plant, like I would say that a lot of operators are pretty open to that because that's a lot of steps and it's kind of, it's one of the most complicated parts of running a facility, right?
Mhm.
But yeah, if you're turning off the procedural automation and it's being run by operations, then that can be very complicated, and even
Mhm.
these like senior operators can, you're just more likely to make a mistake, right? The more
Yeah.
steps that you have to take, the
Yeah.
more complicated it is, which is why it exists in the first place. But I think it all comes down to that kind of education. I would say that, and I think I touched on this earlier, that some of it is like who your operator is and how amenable they are to it. And it's amazing how some of these pieces kind of tie hand in hand because not only
Mhm.
do you need simulation to actually test your procedural automation, but I think having a strong training program is also important for your procedural automation because ultimately, I think a lot of engineers would agree that it comes down to like, is your operator bought into it or not? Because they
Mhm.
always have the opportunity to override something. And so, if you can convince the senior operator or convince, the perhaps loudest voices in the room
Hmm.
of operations, that something is to their benefit, um, and and show them, really train them on how it works so that they trust it, then that can really help. And in an ideal case like that, also it goes hand in hand with you know operator graphics that give them the information they need to build that confidence
Hmm.
and understand what's going on.
It's a
It's
great way to capture that knowledge that's leaving, right? I mean,
it is.
get that experienced people that operators trust, get them
Mhm.
to have good input to those, procedural automation or batch. With batches, in I would say in the same
Mhm.
boat. Um, and then you're not leaving that knowledge on the table when they leave. But to be able to turn it off and maybe not real time, but on a simulator and be able
Yeah.
to run it and say, okay, well, this is what I need to change and modify.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine, just training people on some of these fancy cars that drive themselves, and then
Yeah.
out training them how to drive. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
it'd be chaos.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, yeah, and that's one of the great things about simulation is that, yeah, to your point, like you learn how to do, yeah, you learn how to add and subtract before you learn how to multiply, before you learn how to do all of these other
mhm,
things, right? And yeah, to allow an operator to play around with something and kind of get an understanding of like, okay, well, what is actually happening when I push the button?
mhm,
Or to for yeah um, for like senior operators, something that I've seen that's worked really well when deploying procedural automation has been to actually have them as a part of the requirement specification
mhm,
definition, and have them, whether they are the ones actually, saying like this is how it runs, or whether they are confirming it, at least having them a part of like factory acceptance testing and all of those different things. Because again, all of this kind of coming back to the human error aspect
mhm,
of it, it's some of what you need is human buy-in and human understanding of these different pieces. And so if
mhm,
you can get that, again, if you can get the most influential voice in the room to say, yes, this is correct, or even to say, like, actually, Johnny runs the facility this way, and that is not the way that we want to run it, or that has caused us problems. And,
mhm,
there's just, to your point, so much information that can be captured in state-based automation, or, even in concert with all of the long-standing, do we make a four set point or an interlock so that we kind of make it so that, we can't run the facility in an ineffective way, right?
mhm,
Or only with approval, right? You need somebody to come in and bypass or whatever,
mhm.
right? Like there's always an opportunity to go back if needed, but to really encourage good behaviors, I think is a great way to do that by basically having everybody, including operations, is a part of that design and testing process to say like, yeah, this is what
And
needs
that
to happen.
may be another opportunity for, considering boundaries. We often think
Hmm.
of abnormal and normal.
Yeah,
Maybe operating boundaries is a part of that too. That may be a good another future podcast discussion on how we, you know, what boundaries do we set for the automated systems as well as for things like even how do we represent it on the graphics or the alarms and things like that to say, okay, well, there is some latitude that we'll let the automation run between, and then we want the operator to get involved. So again, as you say, getting the operators to say this may be where Johnny runs it. He does that because
yeah.
he's getting better quality, but his throughput's down. So so there may be some value
Hmm.
in exploring those different type of boundaries to to keep in the ditches. But
Yeah. Well, and I think that opens up another conversation too, which is like, how are we analyzing that data and how are we gathering that
mhm,
data and how are we, you know, in a world where we can have, model predictive control or simulations that are running alongside, then how do we train our model based on how Johnny runs it in this particular instance, and what is actually happening, right,
mhm,
behind the scenes, because there's so much going on in a plant. Like having some of those other tools, right, to really understand and report based on what's going on in the facility can help make those improvements. Yeah. to understand, yeah, if we deploy the state-based automation and the operator comes back and says this isn't running as well as how I run it, like maybe we should evaluate that
Right,
and
right.
understand.
hmm And then, when you make a change, your management of change, you can use
Yes.
maybe the simulator or some other system to practice or to run it to see, well, let the operator at least see the changes and be able to run under those new constraints without
Hmm.
impacting the plant because we can't always do that. And sometimes with our shift systems, I mean, we implement something, we do MOC, and the operator may not see it for 6 weeks because he's
Yeah.
on, he's on his break or whatever. So having an opportunity to test it and do those things, I think, again, that will hopefully help reduce those errors for just not knowing or being unfamiliar with
Yeah.
the systems. So,
Yeah. Well, and that's something that I haven't personally seen as much of. Like I see it during like capital projects and that sort of thing, but
mhm,
I would be curious, because I've always been on more of the capital project side, for long-term deployments, yeah, when or how often operations are really involved in some of these changes. Because to me, when I think about this, there's a lot of players involved in these capital projects, so from construction and electrical and all of these different things. But like when it comes down to it, the people that are involved from the very beginning all the way through, and then they have to live with it, is process automation, E&I.
mhm,
Maintenance comes in only for the life cycle, basically, but and operations, right? So um, I think there's been more of a trend, or I've seen more engagement from operations starting to come in, but like um, understanding more of like what does that look like, and yeah, with the shift systems, like how are we communicating that to maybe a shift or whatever, right? Like where we've got kind of the
mhm,
core team and everybody's, working together. Maybe they do get to see the change and be involved in some of those discussions, but how are we communicating it to some of these later shifts? Because I have been on a site where, we were making a big change and I was on overnights. I just got kind of brought into the project as coverage. And I walk over and I see, something overflowing. And I'm just like, is that, do we know? Do we know about that? Like it was just water, but I was just like, do we know about that? And they
mhm,
were like, oh yeah, that's going to steep 15. And I was like, steep 15. And they're like, the floor. So,
mhm,
it's a different attitude sometimes in these different environments. So also kind of having an understanding of your teams and how
mhm,
what does problem solving look like? Because between day shift and night shift, that might look very different in terms of what they consider to be, you know, uh, something to fix. Because I think there is a hesitance sometimes to
mhm,
problem solve at night because you don't want to introduce additional error into the
mhm.
system, right?
Yeah. But it
So,
also touches on shift handover, whether it's between
mhm.
operators or engineers.
Yeah,
Passing on that situation awareness. Like say if that water had been flowing all shift, but they didn't tell you, or maybe if they just said, "Well, we know that's there," put a note in the log or whatever. So that
yeah.
effective communication between shifts is very important. And again, I'm surprised that wasn't on the list. That.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. I'm like that, like different handoffs is not listed.
Mhm,
Of course, like one of the things, and we had talked about this when we were thinking about bringing this up as a topic, is that this is such a hard thing to study.
mhm,
And there aren't, one of the reasons that this 2019 ARC report is the one that we're calling out, which we'll put a link in the description, so you can go check it out yourself. But one of the challenges is that there aren't a lot of studies like this, right, to even get the data or
mhm,
have a deeper understanding because it is so personal to your facility, right?
mhm,
Because as we talked about earlier, it's going to come down to the amount of money saved. Like if you're a commodity product, some of these justifications might be a lot harder, unless you're
mhm,
able to get an environmental or a safety justification because your product you might not be sold out, your product, might not justify a hundreds of thousands of dollars or $1 million product
mhm.
because you can just come back up quickly enough, right? So, I guess, David, have you seen very many of these types of studies done besides the one that we've kind of discussed here?
No, there's a few. There were some studies, well, back in the 1990s by the ASM consortium that sort of highlighted a lot of these issues. There was a Nova Chemical study on control room design and graphics.
Hmm.
There's some work by EPRI. Obviously, ASM is still going, and the
Hmm.
Centre for Operator Performance. So there's people looking at it, but there's really not a lot of literature out there
Hmm.
that just points us to these numbers. And I guess it's such a topic; it's difficult to put your arms around and say we're just going to study this, and get some.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess it's just a difficult one to put a handle. It'd be nice to do that, and maybe if companies did do better in tracking their KPIs and would be willing to share those, what are the
Hmm.
improvements you've seen? That would be great knowledge to have, and maybe papers at
Yeah.
conferences and so on to reflect those would be good. We just don't
Hmm.
see a lot of it, so. Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
always a challenge. It's
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like some of it is it's a vulnerable position to be in to say we're, if you say that we saved this much, you're also saying that we were losing
hmm
this much, right? Or you're differentiating yourself. If you think about the executives that are approving some of these projects, right, they are
hmm
also differentiating themselves from the competition, right? And, like there are marketing reasons you might or might not want to talk about some of these things. And
hmm
so, either having somebody within your organization or bringing in like a consultant to really look at and kind of dig down and take this kind of comprehensive look at
hmm
your facility, I think can perhaps uncover opportunities, right?
yeah, yeah.
That you could go after, right? Because again, like I have certainly worked with facilities that are, I would say, more on the commodity side, but
hmm
they were able to identify safety and environmental justifications and get $1 million simulators
hmm
because it was part of their company's, it was their core value. They were able to make the justification once. And then once you do that, it's so much easier, right? Talking across sites is also a great way to find out, like,
hmm
okay, well, what did you do to justify getting a simulator in your facility, or what did you do to get upgrades, which everybody can't upgrade at the same time, right? That's just
hmm
gonna drain the pocketbook. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, maybe I can make a case for that thing that I thought.
yeah. And technology is getting cheaper. I mean,
That's true.
the cost of simulation has gone down significantly. Procedural automation, alarm management, all those things, the tools,
Hmm.
the techniques have become more cost effective. But I'm
Yeah.
keen to say that for a long time we were technology constrained in terms of not being able to do what we wanted to do with the data that we
Hmm.
had. Well, now it's sort of flipped. Now we have all the technology, we just don't have the resources to implement it. And
Yeah.
that's, how do you resolve that?
Yeah. Well, and I think another good follow-up would be maintenance, because
hmm
as much as I am a big advocate for some of these technologies, they take effort to maintain, or
hmm
otherwise they kind of become paperweights, or they just sit off to the side and don't. If you don't maintain it, it just isn't adding value and can be make it harder to get future projects justified at the very
Right.
least. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that that would be good to look at.
hmm Yeah. I mean, because some of these, cloud-based systems where they or software as a service where the vendor will help you, those sorts of things are
Yeah.
becoming more affordable.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, they still rely on your data unless they embed
They
somebody
do.
with you and understand the changes you're making and things like that. It's still a difficult proposition to manage
Yeah. Yeah.
outsourced.
And to right size it, right? Some of these are also flexible, right? Like
hmm
as much as it might sound nice to have, some of these technologies deploy across your entire facility. Sometimes it makes sense to just apply it
hmm
where it makes the most sense so that the maintenance is more manageable, whether that's done internally or whether you're, hiring somebody to support you during your life cycle. So it can be a very complex topic, but the especially when I think about like the safety implications of some of these, right? Like being able to reduce the risk of incident, or as an engineer who has worked overnights, perhaps the perhaps the risk that you get called at 3 a.m. right?
Hmm.
Sometimes it's a personal motivation to find the reason, to find the justification for some of these projects.
I think this is we've covered a lot of ground on this particular podcast.
Yeah,
A lot of opportunity to delve deeper into some of these subjects in future ones. So I think we can wrap this one up for today, and then we'll delve deeper in future ones.
please reach out, via LinkedIn or through the comments, and we'd love to hear from you. And